I agree that China's so-called long arm and influence abroad is having implications in human rights issues around the world. For example, we recently saw that Amnesty International was denied a lease in New York after a Chinese state-owned enterprise was involved. Just a few days ago, more than 1,000 Twitter accounts associated with Chinese human rights activists and defenders were mysteriously shut down. We've seen the Chinese government pressure Southeast Asian countries to detain and deport activists or ethnic minorities such as Uyghurs. So the question is, are we equipped to confront these global human rights challenges that China presents? Is there things that we can better do with our partners, allies, and activists on the ground to tackle this issue across the world? I'd like to hear, Ms. Richardson, some idea, if you have some perspectives on that.
Thank you, Senator. It's a broad question, but maybe I can give you an example that speaks to your question and also what the chairman was just asking about. Earlier this year, we were looking into censorship of WeChat, which is a social media platform that's used by Chinese speakers all over the world, and particularly Chinese-speaking diaspora communities, including in the US. And we came upon an example in which a Canadian member of parliament, who is herself of ethnic Chinese descent, had been communicating with her own constituents through her WeChat account. And she had posted both on her WeChat account and on her Facebook page some remarks that were sympathetic towards the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And it was not until we contacted her office to point out that those messages, the messages that had been posted on WeChat, which is of course owned by a large Chinese company, had been censored. And we weren't able to ascertain who exactly had done that. She and her staff hadn't been aware of it, but I think it's a very powerful example, partly of the phenomenon that Chris is talking about spaces in democratic countries that are being exploited, partly because they aren't being watched very carefully. It's not the habit of elected members of bodies in democratic countries to worry about their communications with their own constituents being censored, especially by entities in some other country. So I think there's much to be done, in the realm of simply being vigilant to these threats. We did some work earlier this year about threats to academic freedom outside of China, but as a result of Chinese government pressure. And every single school that we spoke to certainly has honor codes and codes of conduct that speak to issues like cheating and plagiarism. We couldn't find a single one that had on its books any particular rules or instructions or guidelines to even look for examples of embassies threatening students or demanding that they share information with the nearest consulate. Mm-hmm. So I think the problem now is not even so much about changing or updating laws, but being vigilant to these kinds of threats, and taking steps to guard against them.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Walker, in this regard. The NED's report on sharp power documented how the Chinese government is using the space provided by open societies to infiltrate and spread their propaganda. And the lack of reciprocity in U.S.-China relations is evident not only on trade issues, but also when it comes to freedom of information, movement, and academic freedom. Do you think that the Congress should explore further ways to enforce reciprocity in U.S.-China relations beyond trade? Does the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act and its implementation provide a model for other areas?
So I think the Tibet issue is emblematic of the larger challenge, and I would commend everyone here to a report produced by the Hoover Institution and the Asia Society, which focused on this very issue, and it observed that the Chinese authorities deny American institutions systematically access to Chinese society. Whether we talk about educational exchange, cultural exchange, media engagement, we know this from both the harassment that our independent media faces, as well as our public broadcasters that are seeking to reach Chinese audiences. And at the same time, American counterpart institutions are not afforded the same opportunities. I think this is not, in my view, a binary choice between simply denying China access here as a way of responding. I think we need to be creative, and we need to think about ways to publicly shine a light on the fact that China is so stingy with access to our institutions. I don't think we've done that enough. That's a first step. That doesn't cost too much. to make a point that this is the way their system is operating, this is the way they treat their own people, denying them access to perfectly legitimate conversations about a range of issues, corruption, human rights, press freedom. They don't permit that there, and they don't permit it for their own people. They don't permit it for democratic institutions. I think the first step is to have a much more robust discussion to engage on this, and I think that would go a long way towards setting some wheels in motion.
And finally, what should we do about U.S. companies that are involved in providing equipment and other forms of elements of the surveillance that China is using at home and promoting abroad? What should be our policy in that regard?
I think at least until such time as we can determine, or an independent, credible entity can determine that the political education camps in Xinjiang have been closed, I think an end-user ban on selling just about anything to any part of the Xinjiang government is appropriate. Longer term, the UN has set out guidelines for business and human rights that require that each company have a due diligence strategy in place to assure that the company does not have policies or practices or is conducting business in ways that contribute to or enable human rights. And we've had a lot of conversations in the last couple of years with many different kinds of companies, and while most of them have some form of a corporate social responsibility policy, when you ask for an actual due diligence strategy, what steps is that company taking to see who it's selling to, what it's selling, most of them don't have it. And it's worth pointing out that the Thermo Fisher had all of the right export licenses to sell what it did. That was never, we were never contesting that. But the problem with a lot of current export controls is that they haven't kept up with what technology is in demand by Chinese authorities for abusive purposes. So while it's still illegal as a result of the Tiananmen sanctions to sell, for example, handcuffs to the Public Security Bureau, it's perfectly legal to sell DNA sequencers. So there are big gaps, I think, in the export controls that can and should be closed.
Thank you. Thank you.